Hey, everybody. In this episode of Remnant Radio, we're talking about Israel. We're joined today with Jimmy Evans. It's going to be an exciting episode. You guys stay tuned.
You are watching the Remnant Radio, a crowd-funded show where we interview pastors, teachers, historians, and theologians from different churches and denominations. My name is Joshua Lewis, and this is my co-host, Michael Rowntree. Together, we want to help you break outside of your theological echo chambers. If you're interested in learning about history, theology, or the gifts of the Spirit, this is the show for you.
Well, we have got an exciting show for you today. We're talking about Israel. It's one of those subjects that's a heated discussion amongst Christians throughout the ages. But before I dive into the subject, I want to remind you that we are an entirely crowd-funded ministry. There are links in the description if you want to support us. You can give on PayPal or on Patreon. You can give on PayPal as a one-time gift, or you can give on Patreon as a reoccurring giver as low as $5 a month. You get access to extra content there. Without further ado, as my light blows up for no reason, let me toss it over to Michael. Michael, how are you doing over there in the wonderful world of Oklahoma?
I am doing very well, loving Oklahoma, the new home, and excited to interview our friend Jimmy Evans. It's his second time on the show. Again, as you said, talking about this heated subject of Israel and eschatology. So, Jimmy, we just want to toss it over to you. For those who've been hiding under a rock and do not know who Jimmy Evans is, tell us a little bit about yourself and about your ministry and how we can get connected with you. Maybe you could tell us about, I know you got website, books, a marriage ministry, all kinds of stuff. So just tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, thank you, guys. It's great to be with you again. We started XO Marriage 29 years ago now, and it's located here in Southlake, Texas. And my son, Brenton Evans, he is the CEO of that, and we do conferences and we have books. It's xomarriage.com if you want to go on the website. We also have endtimes.com. We do end times teaching. Endtimes.com is a subscription site. It's $7 a month, $77 a year. We have posts all week long, both written, also video posts. I do a Tipping Point podcast every week. We have Greg Laurie. We have Dr. Mark Hitchcock. We have other contributors to that site just for encouragement and education for people who are interested in the end times. It's a lot more in depth. It's something that educates you and keeps you encouraged, because I believe that end times teaching should be encouraging. It's the purpose of prophecy in the Bible. And so we need to be encouraging. So that's what it is. And I have a couple of books. Also, my YouTube channel is just Jimmy Evans. And we have posts that come on there regularly. But we have a couple of books. Tipping Point, this is called, the subtitle is The End is Here. Max Lucado did the foreword for this book. And this is the best book that I've written on the subject of eschatology. It's the only one I've written so far, by the way. But it's the best one I've written. The best information I have on the end times is in this book. It's just a primer for people who are wanting to know more about the times we're living in. And then we also just came out last week with this book, Where Are the Missing People? Now, this book is for people who are left behind in the rapture. We have a lot of people who have told us over the years that they wish they could have something to leave behind for people who are coming through their home or their apartment or their office or something. And the instant after the rapture, the number one question that people are going to be asking is, where are the missing people? And so this book is for sale on Amazon. It's also for sale, and you can get discounts, especially with bulk orders, on missingpeoplebook.com. And you can get Tipping Point on Amazon or xomarriage.com, but you can get this book on missingpeoplebook.com if that's something that interests you.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Jimmy. Can we start off just saying, you know that we have lots of different people here on Remnant Radio, have lots of different eschatological positions, different beliefs about Israel. What would you say to someone who's watching right now that holds a different view than you? How are we to think about them? What would you say to them? That kind of thing.
Well, prophecy, about a third of the Bible is prophecy, and most of that is end-time prophecy. And so I completely understand. I'm never threatened by a person who disagrees with me, ever. Sometimes I disagree with me. Sometimes I have I'm challenged in a particular area where I'm trying to understand something, but, I don't necessarily, have a hardened position on it. But here's what I would say. I'm 68 years old, and I started studying end time prophecy when I was 21 years old. And when I say studying, I mean voraciously. I read the book Late Great Planet Earth, and that rocked my world because I got saved at 19. It rocked my world to think that someone knew the future, especially to think that the Bible foretold the future in advance. And when I began to drill into that and read not just that book, but the Bible, prophecies in the Bible, and then many other books, my views changed dramatically. In the first 20 years, I was a post-tribber. Now I'm a pre-tribber now. I was post-trib for 20 years, a very, very hardened post-tribber. And I read hundreds and hundreds of books, plus studying the scriptures and original languages and all those things. And the reason I changed that position was I just couldn't support it scripturally any longer. And I know that there are a lot of people that still hold that position. I personally don't, because of studying and because of just evolving through, I believe increased knowledge. And prophecy is a tapestry. You don't just find it all in one section. It's an Old Testament, New Testament. You have to look at it, and you have to let the Bible interpret the Bible and let the scriptures as a whole develop your eschatology. And so I believe today that my eschatology is a more mature, well thought out eschatology, but I certainly don't think it's perfect. And for someone to disagree with me, hey, go for it. You could be right. But my opinions, though they're strong, they're educated opinions.
Absolutely. And we've done an episode with you before about the pre-tribulation rapture. So if you guys want to catch a little bit more and understand Jimmy's perspective on that, just search Remnant Radio pre-tribulation rapture, and certainly check out his YouTube channel too, which you can search for Jimmy Evans. Yeah. So Jimmy, we're going to reference your book, Tipping Point, several times today. And in your book, you refer to Israel as a super sign. Could you unpack for us precisely what you mean by this language that Israel is a super sign?
Well, Israel has to exist for the end to come. You can't, because when you read, the book of Revelation, or you read, the book of Daniel, the book of Zechariah, all the different, the book of Luke, where Jesus said Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by Gentiles until the times the Gentiles are fulfilled. All these types of scriptures, the end cannot happen until Israel exists as a nation. Now, and I know we're going to talk a little bit about replacement theology, but let me just say this, and that is there are Christians who are rabidly anti-Israel. I noticed this morning on the Christian Post that the Presbyterian denomination is saying that Israel's occupation of East Jerusalem, the Golan Heights, the West Bank, is equal to slavery. And so, there are Christians who are very, very anti-Zionism, anti-Israel, or whatever. And what I would say is the most important promise in the Bible is in Genesis chapter 12, where it says, I'll bless those who bless you and I'll curse those who curse you, is that Israel's the only nation that God ever started. Israel, there's no other nation in the world that you can say God started that nation. But God took Abram, and he started the nation of Israel, and the existence of Israel proves the existence of God. And so I was in Egypt in the museum, the Egyptian Museum, which is the oldest museum in the world. And I had a Muslim tour guide. A Muslim woman was my tour guide. And we came out of the Tutankhamun area of the museum, and she took us into the Joseph area. And we walked into the Joseph area, and I said, you talking about Joseph in the Bible? And she said, yeah, Joseph in the Bible. This is his area here. This is where his Pharaoh, these are all the artifacts from his Pharaoh. And I said, you believe in Joseph? She said, of course I believe in Joseph. That's our history. She said, the Jewish people lived in the choicest part of the land here. Well, the point is the history of Egypt proves that there was a man named Joseph, and the Jews came there. Of course, if there was a Joseph, there was a Moses. There was a Joseph, there was also an Isaac and an Abraham. And the story of Israel is the story of the entire Bible. It goes from Genesis to Revelation. But with end-time prophecy, Zechariah 12 says, I'll make Jerusalem a heavy stone, a burdensome stone in the end times, though all the nations of the earth are gathered against it. We see that happening right now. But in Joel chapter 3, and I know this is a scripture that we're going to talk a little bit about here. Now, this is God in the first person speaking through the prophet Joel. And he says, behold, in those days and at that time, when I bring back the captives of Judah and Jerusalem, I will also gather all nations and bring them down to the valley of Jehoshaphat, and I will enter into judgment with them there on account of my people, my heritage Israel, whom they've scattered among the nations. They have also divided up my land. Now, this is God in the first person telling us that the end times began when he brought back Israel. Now, some people would say this is what he brought back Israel from Babylon. He says here, bring them back from all the nations. When the children of Israel came back from Babylon or Persia, it was one nation. The Babylonians took them. Of course, then the Persians defeated the Babylonians, and then they came back from Persia and Babylon. Okay, this is saying that there's going to be a worldwide regathering of Israel. And God says, when I do that, when I bring back the captives of Judah and Jerusalem from all over the world, I'm going to enter into judgment with them in the valley of Jehoshaphat. The valley of Jehoshaphat is the valley between the Mount of Olives and the Temple Mount. And Jehoshaphat means Jehovah is judged. And this is where Zechariah 12, Zechariah 14 talk about a worldwide judgment on the world that is all gathered against Jerusalem. Jerusalem is the location in the world where Armageddon is going to take place. And you see this happening right now in the United Nations. You see this happening in the world right now. Jerusalem is the most contested piece of real estate in the world. And the Biden administration right now is trying to force Israel to give up East Jerusalem. They're trying to put a consulate for the Palestinians in East Jerusalem. The Jewish people are building, the Israeli government's building 9,000 settlements or houses in North Jerusalem, which is East Jerusalem right now. And the Biden administration is trying to stop them. And it says here, I'm going to enter into judgment with you on account of my people, my heritage Israel, whom they've scattered among the nations. That happened, of course, beginning in AD 70. When the Romans defeated the Jews and razed Jerusalem, killed over 1 million Jews, took the rest of them and scattered them around the world. You've scattered them among the nations. You've also divided up my land. This is what's happening right now. The United States, the United Nations have been pressuring Israel to give up land. Of course, since the day the Israel began as a nation, we have been pressuring them. There's a book that I want to recommend to your viewers and listeners. And it's a book called Eye to Eye by a man named William Koenig. And it has over 150 documented, this is historically documented instances where the United States has pressured Israel to give up land and where a historic catastrophe has hit the United States. So let me give you a recent, in 2005, it was Hurricane Katrina. We forced Israel out of Gaza in 2005 under the George W. Bush administration. 5 days later, Hurricane Katrina hit the Gulf Coast, and the Jewish rabbi said, that's what you get for forcing us out of the Gaza. But the tornado, and I believe it was back in November or so that this tornado hit Kentucky. It was a 230-mile-long tornado, the longest in history. And it may have been a multiple group of tornadoes, but it was the longest in history. That was the same week that the Biden administration was trying to force the Israeli government to stop building the housing settlements in North Jerusalem. And so God is angry, according to Joel 3, and he calls the land of Israel his land. Of course, all the world belongs to God. But the Jewish people are special by covenant. I know some people would say, are you saying, Jimmy, that there's the church and then there's the Jews, and the Jews are as special or more special? The Jewish people are special by covenant. The covenant that God made with Abraham was an everlasting covenant. So they're special by covenant. Now, a Jewish person is not going to go to heaven unless they receive Jesus as their Messiah. The original church was 100% Jewish. And so if a Jew does not receive Christ, they're not going to heaven. They're not the church. The church is Jew and Gentile who has received Christ into their lives as their Messiah. But they're special by covenant. And so when God says, I'll bless those who bless you, I'll curse those who curse you, all throughout history and even recent history, you look at Egypt, you look at Babylon, you look at Rome, you look at Germany, you look at all these nations that have cursed Israel or come against the Jews, it has not gone well for them. And in my opinion, if America has done nothing else to deserve the blessing of God, we have stood with Israel for the most part, except for making them divide up their land. That's a long answer.
Okay. You said in that that Jesus enters into final judgment over the nations. Are we to understand this as the second coming? And then if it is the second coming, should we expect rapture to happen 7 years prior?
I believe that. And let me unpack that a little bit. Now, Zechariah 14 and Revelation 19 are parallel texts of the second coming. Now, the second coming is a very, very visible event. Matthew 24, Jesus said, all the tribes of the earth will see him. They'll all see him coming. Revelation 19. Revelation 19, by the way, starts with the marriage supper of the Lamb chronologically. It starts with the marriage supper of the Lamb in heaven. Of course, that's the church marrying Jesus. Then Jesus, of course, is on a white horse, and we're with him, and he returns there, takes the false prophet and the Antichrist, throws him into the lake of fire alive, binds Satan for 1,000 years. That's the second coming, and it's an exact parallel of Zechariah chapter 14. They both talk about him coming to the Mount of Olives. He defeats the nations of the earth there that have gathered against Jerusalem. Could not be a more public event. And by the way, in Matthew 24, Jesus describes a rapture at the end of the tribulation. He said, after the tribulation, immediately after the tribulation of those days, sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light. And he says, and I'll send my angels to the four corners of the earth to gather the elect. Well, there's going to be zillions of people that get saved during the tribulation. And that's talked about in Revelation 7 with all the saints there that have been martyred, Revelation 6 and Revelation 7, Revelation 20, all the people who were beheaded because they wouldn't worship the Antichrist, whatever. So there's going to be a lot of people. And some people say, well, why are there two raptures? Well, there's a rapture before and there's a rapture at the end because there have been many people that have gotten saved. And Revelation 20 says, and they came back to life and reigned with Christ for 1,000 years. So these people are a part of the church. So 7 years earlier, the tribulation is a 7-year period of time. We get that from Daniel chapter 9, where Gabriel came to Daniel and told him there'd be 490 prophetic years to fulfill all time, or all the time of this age. And these are 490 years related to Israel, and there would be 483 years, and that there would be 7 years, okay? And so 483 years, by the way, have been exactly fulfilled from March 14th, 445 BC, when Artaxerxes Longimanus gave a decree for the Jews to go back and rebuild Jerusalem until April 2nd, 32 AD, which was when Jesus rode into the Jerusalem on Palm Sunday and began his death march to the cross. That is exactly to the day, historically fulfilled, 483 years. The 7 years that are left are the tribulation that begin with a covenant being affirmed between the Antichrist and between Israel. Again, that's Daniel 9. So we have 7 years left, the time of Jacob's sorrow, the worst time in the history of the world. We have that left. And so I believe that the rapture will happen before the tribulation for this reason, okay? And there's several texts that I look to that are the most important texts in this. The first is Luke chapter 17. And the Pharisees asked Jesus when the end would come, and he kind of put them off. Then he turned to the disciples and he said, the days when the Son of Man comes, it's going to be like lightning that flashes in the sky from the east to the west. And of course, this is parallel to what 1 Thessalonians says, that the rapture happens in the clouds with Jesus in the air. Jesus is talking about lightning flashing, an immediate event that happens up in the clouds. And then he says, the coming of the Son of Man will be like the days of Noah. They were buying, selling, marrying, and giving in marriage until the day that Noah got on the ark and the flood came and destroyed them all. It will also be like the days of Lot. They bought, they sold, they planted, they built, they married, they gave in marriage until the day that Lot went out of Sodom. And this is very important. On the day that Lot went out of Sodom and Gomorrah, and the hellfire and brimstone came and destroyed them all. Even so, it will be in the day when the Son of Man is revealed. And then he describes the rapture. This is the same text there where he says, two people will be laying in one bed, one taken, one left. There'll be two women grinding in a mill, one taken, one left. And so in the same place that he says it will be like the days of Noah, wicked world, full of violence, a righteous remnant, living for God, waiting for deliverance, okay? In the same day that happens, there's going to be two people standing in a field and one taken, one left. Now, let me say, buying, selling, marrying, giving in marriage, planting, building. This is what Jesus said in direct parallel to the days of Noah and Lot and the day when he comes. Okay, and he said the day, definite article day, not a day, the day when he comes will be just like before Noah got on the boat, just like when Lot went out, then immediate judgment came. So if I came to you, so some people would say the rapture won't happen until the end of the tribulation. Okay. There won't be buying and selling and marrying, giving in marriage and planting and building at the end of the tribulation. 3/4 of the earth's population is dead. All sea life is dead. Wormwood has hit the earth. The Antichrist has killed only the Lord knows how many millions and millions of people. The earth is a smoldering ruin at the end of the tribulation. Buying, selling, marrying, giving in marriage, planting, building speak of hope for the future. If I say to you, the end of the world is going to happen in 90 days, will you marry me? Well, that doesn't make any sense. The end of the world is going to happen in 6 months. Let's build a house. Well, that doesn't make any sense. Or let's plant a crop. That buying and selling, marrying, giving in marriage, the people of Noah's day, the people of Lot's day, it was just business as usual. They thought they were winning. They thought there wasn't going to be any judgment for their behavior. But Noah did and Lot did, and they were living for God. Jesus said it's going to be just like that. He's going to deliver us. Okay, so the tribulation isn't judgment. The tribulation is wrath. The Revelation 6 calls the tribulation the wrath of the Lamb, which is such an interesting comment. A lamb, the little innocent lamb, is going to be full of wrath. Okay, why would this, by the way, the lamb is Jesus. We know that. He has been spit on. His name is the number one curse word in the world today. He's been rejected. He's been reviled, and he's shown nothing but grace and mercy and grace and mercy and grace and mercy until the rapture happens and the tribulation begins, and it will be the wrath of God for 7 years. And you can't stop it. You can stop judgment by repentance. You can't stop wrath. And people can get saved during the tribulation, but it will be the wrath of Almighty God. And I will say this about the rapture being before the tribulation. Jesus isn't mad at us. We're the ones who have accepted him. We're the ones who follow him. And 1 Thessalonians chapter 1 tells us that Jesus comes. We're waiting for the Son to appear from heaven who delivers us from the wrath to come. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, Paul says, God has not destined us for wrath. Therefore, comfort each other with these words. And so we are not destined for wrath. And Jesus said, by the way, in Luke 21, pray that you may be counted worthy to escape all these things and to stand before the Son of Man. He's talking about the tribulation. He was talking about the end of the world. Pray that you may be counted worthy to escape all these things. And some people say, well, Jimmy, you're an escapist. Yes, I am. I'm an obedient escapist because Jesus said that I could escape all those things and to stand before him, which is, I believe, the rapture at the beginning of the tribulation, the rapture, 7-year tribulation, and then the second coming.
Okay, Jimmy. I want to talk about the generation because a lot of this interpretation hinges upon, we started with Israel's formation, 1948, and then we add a generation to that. And there's a statement that Jesus makes, I know you're very aware of, Matthew 24:34, that truly I say to you, all of these things, or that this, what's the exact word? I have it. This generation will not pass away. Yeah, until all of these things take place. All of these things being famine, earthquake, wars, rumors of wars, etc. And, a lot of people will say, well, Jimmy, we can look at that period leading up to 70 AD, and we have this earthquake happened, and Mount Vesuvius erupted and caused tons of chaos, and there were, Caesar was launching this war and that war, and there was famine and these various locations, and all of these things happened in Jesus's day. So Jesus was actually talking about something that happened in the past. So when he says this generation, he was referring to his hearers, and this would be the most natural way to understand it, versus this generation referring to the terminal generation, the final generation. Talk to us about why you would interpret it that way, that it refers to the final generation versus Jesus' generation.
Well, it's the preterist view that the end happened in the first century, that that all the events, the ones that you just described there, that the apocalyptic events that John described in Revelation was speaking of first century events. The only problem was that the book of Revelation, didn't come out until all those things were finished. And that in itself is troubling. But here's what I would say. Jesus is describing in Matthew 24 global events, not events just specific to Jerusalem or Israel, global events. He's talking about the abomination of desolation, of course, the second coming, which did not happen. There was not a visible return of Christ in the first century. But so I'm just saying I do not agree with the preterist view for all those reasons. But let me say the text I go back to is Joel 3. Someone could argue and someone could say, well, Jesus was talking about that generation. Okay, well, so here's the text I go back to. This is Joel 3. Behold, in those days and at that time, when I bring back the captives of Judah and Jerusalem, I will also gather all nations and bring them down to the valley of Jehoshaphat, and I will enter into judgment with them there. This hasn't happened. No, historically, this has not happened. So God is saying, in those days and at the same time, Jesus said, this generation won't pass away until all these things are fulfilled. So Jesus is saying that the end is a one-generational event. It's a one-generation event. Now, then you have to talk about how long is a generation. God is saying here in Joel 3, at the same time I do this, I'm going to do this. In the same time frame, I'm going to do both things. Okay, so some people are, well, that could be 1,000 years. Well, doesn't sound like it to me. Sounds like it to me that God has in mind a specific period of time when he is going to fulfill the regathering of Israel from the nations, not from Babylon, not from Persia, from the nations. They weren't scattered until after AD 70. They were scattered for the next 1,000 years, around, or more than that, around the world after AD 70. Now they're coming back to Israel from all the nations of the world, exactly the way that Joel 3 says here. So again, this is first person. So God is telling us in his mind, the end, Israel, the clock started when Israel came back in God's mind. This is what he's telling us. And the clock stops when he brings all the nations to the valley of Jehoshaphat and enters into judgment with them there. So if I said to you, hey, Michael, Joshua, I'm going to come over to your house, I'm going to mow your yard. When I'm there, I'm going to paint your fence. Well, what happens if you come home and the yard's mowed and the fence isn't painted? And you call me and said, well, Jimmy, you said when you came over, you were going to paint my fence. I said, well, I didn't mean today. It'd be confusing. At the same time, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this. And so I'm saying there's a period of time, one generation, I believe, that Jesus was talking about in Matthew 24, that God is talking about in Joel 3, that God is going to regather Israel and bring the nations in judgment. And I'm going to say this. It's happening today. In December of 2021, the United Nations, they had resolutions for 19 nations, censuring 19 nations, 19 resolutions for countries around the world. 14 of the 19 were about Israel. They have censured Israel more than all the nations of the world combined. It's just amazing that this tiny little country in the Middle East, about the size of New Jersey, can garner the attention that it garners on the world stage. And I'm saying, I believe that we're living in the days just prior to the nations of the world through the United Nations marching on Jerusalem and trying to enforce a two-state solution. It's in the news every single day. So I believe it's a one-generation event.
Interesting.
That did not happen in the first century.
Okay, so I've got questions about the generation. You mentioned a moment ago, well, it depends on how we count a generation. So I want to know, how do we count a generation? I remember for a long time it was 70 years. I remember in Bible school it was 70 years. And, 2018 came and went. I think that was 70 years from Israel's establishment in 1948. I'm bad with math. They're established 70 years from that would have been 2018. Some are saying it's 80 years now, so that would be like 2028. We can't know the time or hour, but maybe we can know the biblical year. I don't know exactly how we would quantify that, but let's just say, so two questions. One is, can we know the general time frame in which it's coming? What's a generation? And I guess a follow-up question would be, like, let's say 8 years from now, someone's watching this video. Should their faith be placed in this kind of assurance that within one generation Jesus will return if he doesn't come back within how we define a generation?
Yeah, and I think that's a wonderful question. Some people say it's 120 years based on Genesis. The God says, the days of man will be 120 years. Again, I think you can look at current events, and I just don't see things happening another 40 or 50 years. It could, but I'm just saying, I believe that according to Psalm 90, the days of a man's life are 70 years, or if by reason of strength, they're 80 years. In 1960, the average age was 68. Today, the average age is 78. This is how long people are living. So it's, 70 to 80 years is a generation. And so let's just say it's 80 years. And you're exactly right, Joshua. We're 73 years right now since Israel became a nation. So if the tribulation started, if the rapture happened this year and the tribulation started, I guess, or 2022, I guess now we're in May, will be, I guess, 74 years. So if the tribulation started, we'll be 7 years later, we'll be 80, 81 years. And so I believe, I put my confidence in the scripture. I believe that I don't believe a person's faith should be shattered if, in 7 years or whatever, the end hasn't come, based on my teaching or anybody else's, because a generation could be longer. It could be. But I think what Jesus was trying to convey was, this is not a 300 or 400 or 500 year event, because some people say that. And of course, people who are amillennial or postmillennial, many of them believe that it's a thousands and thousands of years event. In other words, even it started when Jesus was resurrected, or when he ascended. That the millennium is a period of time that's just goes on. And so I believe that the Bible is very specific about the millennium being 1,000 years. The Bible is very specific about the tribulation being 7 years long. And I believe Jesus, and also in Joel chapter 3, is very specific that the end, the time from the time that Israel becomes a nation until the time of the very end, is a specific period of time. And I believe that it's 80 years, 70, 80 years, however long it is. My faith won't be rocked if it doesn't happen in 80 years or 83 years. Now, if it doesn't happen in 140 years, my faith would be rocked. Of course, I'll be dead by then anyway. But what was your other question?
I think that covered the gist of it. It was okay. How long is a generation? Is it 70? Is it 80 years?
Should our faith be rocked?
Should our faith be rocked?
So I think he hit it.
No.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's just talk about two people of God, Israel, the church. Does God have two different programs, or is it really just one people of God from the beginning to end? Because some would say we're making too much of the political nation of Israel. And you used the term earlier, replacement theology. Maybe you could unpack that and help our viewers understand, because some are going to look at this and they're going to say, well, but I read the New Testament and it says things like, that we're all Abraham's children. So doesn't Genesis 12 apply to me, that those who bless or curse me will be blessed or cursed because I'm one of Abraham's children? Help us understand some of these New Testament promises and just kind of the whole understanding of what you mean by replacement theology.
Well, let's go back to Genesis 12. And God blessed Abraham with a genetic blessing. It wasn't just a spiritual blessing. It was a genetic blessing on his children. Now, we know through the world today, the Jews are superior people. They win more Nobel Prizes. There are more nuclear physicists. They're a special group of people that have outperformed every other group of people on the earth, though they represent a tiny percentage. It's just true. And they were hated by Hitler. They were hated by many people around the world from jealousy. People were just jealous of them. So it's interesting. Genesis 12, we begin the Jewish people and the blessing. And here's the interesting thing. Galatians 3 says Jesus became a curse for us so that the blessing of Abraham could come to the Gentiles through faith. That Jesus, and here's what I tell people, Jesus didn't just die to forgive us of our sins. Jesus died to forgive us of our sins and to break the curse of sin over our lives. But Jesus didn't just die for those two things. Jesus died so the Gentiles could enter into a genetic blessing that came upon Abraham and his children. See, the seed, the people of God began in the Old Testament. God loved everybody, just like he loves everybody today. But there was a special group of people in the Old Testament, beginning with Abraham, that became the Jewish people. And through them, we have the most important book in the world, the Bible, the most important man in the world, Jesus Christ, and the most important organization in the world, the church. All of them came through the Jews. And so the church was birthed on the day of Pentecost with all Jews, 100% Jews. And then later, when Cornelius's house got saved, the Jews were like, hey, look here. God's going to do among the Gentiles what he did with us. That's great. Let's let them in the club. And now, since that has happened, we're talking about replacement theology, when Israel ceased to exist in AD 70 as a nation, and they were scattered around the world, it was in the Middle Ages that replacement theology began. It was probably before that, but replacement theology became popular because the church fathers at that time just looked around and said, hey, we're the church and God loves us and Israel doesn't exist. And so wherever the Bible talks about Israel, it's really talking about us. The problem is they're back, just the way the Bible said they would be. They're back. They're special by covenant, but they're not the church. The Jews are not the church. Israel's not the church. And one of the things you said that I think is really important to pick up on is, do we make too much about Israel? And let me just kind of divide that if I could. The Jewish people are not perfect by any means. We took a trip, a church tour to Israel, and went to Eilat on the Red Sea, and it was a nude beach. Now, we didn't know it was a nude beach. We didn't ask to go there, but I've got this sweet little group of my church people, and we're out there on the beach, and they're just as naked as they can possibly get. And the bus had left. The bus had dropped us off and left us. They went in town to get stuff for hot dogs. So we cooked hot dogs, and all these church people are sitting there with a bunch of nude Israelis on. And what shocked me was how unholy the Holy Land really is. It's a very secular nation for the most part.
It's like super pro-gay.
So I don't, absolutely. And so I don't think at all that Israel is this perfect nation that does no wrong. I don't think that at all. I know that God loves the Palestinians, and I know that he cares about the Palestinians. I believe that they're special by covenant. And when God calls Israel his land, that's what he means. This is his land. Historically, it's the Jews' land. And in the spirit realm, so on the one hand, I think we make too much of Israel. I think a lot of people think that Israel can do no wrong, and they do wrong. Okay. On the other hand, there is a spiritual importance to Israel. Today, still, I believe, if you bless Israel, you're blessed. If you curse them, you're cursed. I'm not talking about honestly critiquing their behavior. I'm talking about the Jewish people. There are people that they believe that replacement theology. I heard a famous evangelist in person. I was in the crowd. I heard a famous evangelist say, why would God care about a little armpit of a nation in the Middle East that doesn't make any difference in the world? He was referring to Israel. And so those kinds of comments, I think, are dangerous comments. To call Israel occupiers of East Jerusalem or occupiers of, wherever, the West Bank or whatever, is a dangerous thing. To state that Israel is an apartheid state is a dangerous thing. And so I believe that anti-Semitism is a spirit. I don't believe it's a belief system. I don't think it's a thought system. I believe it's a spirit. It's the same spirit that tried to kill the babies when Moses was born. The same spirit that tried to kill the babies when Jesus was born is trying to kill the Jews today, that same spirit. And so I just believe that we need to be careful as a church to know we're the church. We're the church. Jew or Gentile, we're the church. There's only one church. There's only one people of God. But the Jews are special by covenant, and I believe we need to respect that.
Jimmy, help me out understand what does it mean to really bless or to curse Israel? Like, let's say you've got King Ahab. He's Israel, right?
Yeah.
We'd want to throw down King Ahab. We would want to defeat King Ahab. And I know this is a huge myth. We don't really know that there's any kind of historical data behind this, but it's speculated that maybe Hitler's grandfather or something like that was Jewish, potentially. Again, no real, but again, let's just pretend that was actually factual. It would be good to overthrow Hitler as a Jewish guy. So that's not what it means to curse. And then when it comes to blessing, does it mean that I just speak well of them? Does it mean that I give financial contributions? It's like, hey, send people to go do missions with my $500 or go buy an olive tree in, Israel as a way to bless the Jewish people. So it's like, what does it really mean to bless, and what does it really mean to curse when we talk in these terms?
Great question. Let me take you to Matthew 25. So Jesus in Matthew 24, it's the Olivet Discourse where he's talking about the end, very graphic description of the end times. He gets to Matthew 25 and he tells two parables and a true story. And the purpose of the parables in the true story is to prepare us for judgment. He's talking about three judgments. The 10 virgins are the first judgment, and this is the judgment of, do you know the bridegroom? The only thing that matters when Jesus returns as it relates to heaven or hell is, do you know him personally? And this is an interesting thing, there were 10 virgins, and 5 were foolish, and the bridegroom said, I never knew you, and they were not allowed into the wedding. There were 5 wise virgins that were allowed into the wedding. Interestingly, Jesus gave a percentage that when he returned, half the church would be false, because the 10 virgins represent the church. Okay, half the church would be false, and half the church would not know him. Okay, that's interesting. The second parable he told was the parable of the talents, and he's talking about all of us have been given talents, and when he comes, he wants a return from our life. He wants a return on his investment. And the 2 men came to him and said, Master, your 5 talents made 5 more talents. Your 2 talents made 2 more talents. He said, well done, come, good and faithful servant, enter into the joy of your master. This other guy came up and said, who are you? You're a bad guy. You're asking for something that doesn't belong to you. And Jesus said, you throw that man in the outer darkness where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth, and take his talent and give it to the man who has 10. So he's talking about our lives are supposed to be meaningful for God. Doesn't mean we have to be perfect, but we live to serve God. That's the point. But the third parable, the third true story, this is not a parable. When the Son of Man returns, he's going to set the nations before him and separate them as a shepherd separates sheep from the goats. And I'm going to take the sheep and put them on my right hand. And I'm going to say to them, I was sick and in prison. I was hungry. I was naked. I was hurting, and you helped me. And they're going to, and both groups, by the way, are surprised. Both groups are shocked at what's happening. And they said to him, Lord, when did we see you hungry? When did we see you naked? When did we see you in prison or sick and come see you? And Jesus said, when you did it to one of the least of these, my brethren, you did it to me. That's an interesting statement. My brethren. This is the sheep and goat judgment that happens at the end of the tribulation. And Jesus there's different ways you can interpret this, because it could be Christians. He could be talking about when you didn't do it to the least of these, my Christian. What he's talking about is during the tribulation, you saw these people suffering, but you helped them. You visited them in prison. You visited them in the hospital. You gave them food. You gave them clothing. My brethren. And I believe it pertains to Israel. I believe that this is a judgment of the nations at the end of the tribulation on how they dealt with Israel. Now, remember, this is an individual judgment. This is not, when it says he's going to bring all the nations before him, the word is ethnos. In the Greek, it means people groups. So he's going to take all the people groups of the world and bring them before him, but he separates them one from another as a shepherd separates sheep and goats. So this is an individual judgment of the Gentiles and how they dealt with the Jews. Now, it can be interpreted that it's the way they dealt with Christians. But then he turns to the goats and says, I was sick and in prison, hungry, naked. You didn't help me. And they said, when did we see you like that, Lord? He said, when you didn't do it to the least of these, you didn't do it to me. So I believe that God takes very personally the way we treat the Jewish people. And I believe blessing means good. It just means talking good about them, blessing them. And I, Joshua, when you were talking about, Hitler and Ahab and all that stuff, you don't let an evil Jew, go undealt with just because he's a Jew. I totally understand that. But I think that even then, because they're Jewish, you just have to have a little bit more fear of God because they're Jewish, and be careful in how you deal with that person. So I believe personally, and I'll just tell you a real short story here, and that is, I was in a bookstore when I first got saved, and I saw a poster on the wall. It was a Christian bookstore, and it said Israel on it. Now, I didn't know a Jew. I didn't know what a Jew was. I didn't know what Israel was. I had no idea. I didn't even know how to say it. It just said Israel. I thought it said Israel. and there was a menorah on there. That's all there was. Israel and a menorah on the poster. I absolutely fell in love and didn't know what happened to me, didn't know what Israel meant. I mean, it's like I saw a picture of the most beautiful woman in the world and fell in love with her. And I walked up to the counter in the bookstore and I said, "What is that sign over there?" And he said, "What sign?" I pointed at it. He said, "Israel." I said, "What does that mean?" He said, "Well, it's a nation in the Middle East." I said, "So?" He said, "Well, that's where Jesus came from." I said, "Oh, really?" He said, "Yeah, the Jewish people." And I said, "What's a Jew?" He said, "Well, that's Jesus. The people like Jesus, they're Jews." So when I talk to people about Israel, I mean, literally, when I didn't even know who they were, I fell madly in love with them and have been madly in love with them ever since. I can criticize them. I can see the fault in them, but I'm just careful how I talk about them and I'm careful how I treat them. And yes, Josh, I do believe that it's helpful to give to ministries that help Israel. And there are many that help Israel. You need to check them out because there's some bad ones. But there are many good ministries out there that help Israel, buying olive trees to be planted, whatever. That's not a bad idea either. But I think that we need to be very careful as believers, our attitude toward the Jewish people and behavior toward them, because I do believe it's part of our judgment someday.
So can I just to kind of follow up to that one? I'm looking at the verse that you're quoting in Matthew. There in verse 46, he says, "Then they will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous will enter into eternal life." So this is an eternal judgment sort of punishment, and it am I right in thinking that if you do interpret this as Israel, then it's like your eternal salvation can hinge upon how you think of Israel as a nation and how you bless them versus cursing them?
Well, that all three of the judgments of Matthew 25 are eternal. All three end with someone being excluded from the marriage supper, heaven, enter into the joy of your master. And then in Matthew 25, the interesting thing there, he says, "Depart from me into the hell that was prepared for the devil and his angels." God never prepared hell for humans. That happened after the fall. And of course, God knew it was going to happen, but that's where they go. So at the end of that judgment, the people who did not help the people of God go into eternal damnation. The people who helped them go into everlasting life. So it's interesting in that it's almost, Joshua, like accepting the Jewish people. Jesus, it seems as though that accepting the Jewish people during the tribulation was tantamount to receiving Christ, because at the end of it, they received eternal life. And so it's interesting. And I don't know that I completely understand it. That's one of those things that I read and I study, but it is a very, very powerful thing.
I do think I heard a caveat there that I think framed it well for me. You said during the tribulation, and I might have missed that earlier, because then I'm thinking of all these guys who are replacement guys, and I go, man, if that's the case, there's a wide swath of Christians who ain't going to make it. But I think that kind of during the tribulation, because you're talking about increased levels of anti-Semitism, unfairness, a special level of hate that people are turning a blind eye to, and that is way more palatable to me than what I heard the first time. For whatever reason, I probably missed it.
Well, so remember, the context of Matthew 25 is, I was naked, I was hungry, I was sick, I was in prison. This is tribulation. This is, I was in very difficult circumstances, and you turned your back, or you helped me. So yes, I do think that's an important caveat. This is a judgment. At the second coming, he comes back, and this is the judgment. So yes, I believe that it's specific to the tribulation.
That's helpful.
Yeah. Jimmy, I'd like to just kind of shift gears a little bit and just talk about this phrase I've heard you use before, both in talking as well as in your book or books, the prophetic end time clock. So maybe let's talk a little bit about current events and where we are on the clock. We have Iran and things that have happened with the nuclear deal. We have all kinds of events occurring in Israel. The embassy moved to Jerusalem. We have Russia and Putin. We have recent events in the Ukraine, and there's so much going on. And I know that you think these things are significant. So could you share with our viewers some of the most significant current events and how they align with what you see as the prophetic time clock.
Yeah, the pressure on Israel to give up land is, I think, paramount, because this is Armageddon. Armageddon will happen. I heard Benjamin Netanyahu say on a number of occasions that Jerusalem is the eternal, indivisible capital of Israel. We'll never give it up, and they won't. And this is what will cause, ultimately, the nations of the world, the United Nations, to try to physically force Israel to give up Jerusalem, which creates Armageddon. So we're seeing very, very strong labor pains. Before something is birthed, the labor pains get worse, and they're getting worse. And so, but another main thing for me is Iran. Now, the Gog and Magog war of Ezekiel 38 and 39 has not happened. And some people confuse this with Armageddon. Gog and Magog of Ezekiel 38 and 39, this is a specific group of nations that are listed. In Armageddon, it's all the nations of the world. So it's not just a few nations. So we see Russia. Gog is Russia. Magog, Gog's a person, Magog is the land. But this is Russia, Meshech, Tubal. These are the stand states mostly, that were a part of the old Soviet Union, but they're under Russia today. Kakistan, Uzbekistan, all of these. Iran is Persia. Turkey is several of the nations listed there are the modern day Turkey, Libya, the Sudan, which Ethiopia is listed, but that's the modern day Sudan. These are all aligned with Russia. They're armed by Russia. They're against Israel. And so Iran today it's the Islamic Republic of Iran. They are the most pure Islamic experiment on the planet. There's a huge revival in Iran, by the way. Many people are getting saved. But the people of Iran are precious. They're Persian people, and they're precious people. The government is evil. And the government believes that we have an eschatology, so do the Muslims. And the Muslims believe that it's their responsibility. This is what the Iranian government officially believes and states publicly, is that they have been called by Allah to destroy Israel and usher in the end times. That when they destroy Israel, the hidden imam will be revealed and come with Jesus, and Jesus will tell everybody that he's a Muslim and convert everybody to Islam, and that the hidden imam will come. And so they believe that this is what they're called to do. So there was an article this week in the Jerusalem Post, chilling article, and I can't remember the name of this body, but it was an independent international body that was looking at and just diagnosing the issue between Iran and Israel. And they said the Iranians are never going to stop doing what they're doing. And Israel's not taking this seriously enough. Okay. Israel has put in their budget this year to bomb Iran. Okay. That they are practicing. They're having military exercises.
They budgeted for it like groceries.
Like groceries, $5 billion.
Yeah.
They budgeted $5 billion to bomb Iran. Yeah. And so it says in Ezekiel 38, God's saying to Gog and Magog nations, I'm going to put a hook in your jaw, and I'm going to draw you down to the mountains of Jerusalem, and I'm going to destroy you there myself. Well, the hook was an animal hook. When you had a stubborn donkey or something that wouldn't obey you, you just reached over with this stick with a hook on it, and you put it in its mouth, and you drug it around. And so what God is saying is, this is not your decision. I'm going to provoke you into coming down and striking Iran. By the way, on the northern border of Israel, we have Iran, the Iranian army. They're building fortresses on the northern border that Israel's bombing constantly. Russia has a military base and a permanent seaport in Syria. You have, of course, Hezbollah and Hamas that are proxies for the Iranians. You have the Syrians. You have the Turkish deal. They're all there on the northern border of Israel right now. This Gog and Magog has started. I mean, this war has already started. And Israel and Iran are bombing each other. They're in conflict right now. So Iran has enough, as far as we know from Israeli intelligence, they have enough enriched uranium right now for a bomb. Just one. It'll take them another couple of months to get enough for another bomb. And all they're looking for is a delivery mechanism. They already have the enriched uranium. And so the Israeli government is saying, we will never allow Iran to become a nuclear power. It's just not going to happen. At any cost, and this is their public statements, at any cost, we will not let them get a nuclear weapon. So I believe, and I put this in my book, Tipping Point, and we published this last year, is I believe that Israel will bomb Iran. I think they're an existential threat to Israel. They're
and it's
going to bomb Israel.
justifiable too. Well, you've got a nation who's like, we're making a nuclear weapon, and we completely believe that it's our mission from God to destroy all of you. So it's like, what do you think they're going to do with that weapon? Like, defend yourself.
So your crazy neighbor, your crazy neighbor comes over to you one day and says, hey, I'm going to go over to my garage over there and build a gun. As soon as I'm finished, I'm going to come over and kill you. What do you do? Just sit there?
Yeah, and good illustration.
And he's capable, and you know good and well he's capable of it, and he's going to do it. Mm-hmm. So Israel is justifiable, but I believe that this is going to be the provocation. See, remember, Russia has helped Iran with all their nuclear technology, and Russian scientists are all through the installations there, military and nuclear installations in Iran. If Israel bombs Iran, then there's going to be just all heck will break loose with the Russians. And of course, the Russians have always warned America and the United States to leave Iran alone. They're going to bomb Iran, and when it happens, I believe that could be the hook that pulls them down. Another little thing about the Gog and Magog war that's very interesting is that it says that they come down for booty, and it says that Sheba, Dedan, Tarshish, and her young lions challenge the Gog and Magog alliance as they come down to take booty. Now, Iran doesn't care about the natural resources as much. They want the Jerusalem. But Russia, the Jews have discovered, I believe it's 20 trillion cubic feet of natural gas off their coast in the Mediterranean. This is a $1 zillion worth of natural gas. They're building a pipeline from Israel to Europe, and Israel will now become a direct competitor with Russia in selling energy to the Europeans. And so the Russians want the seaports on the Mediterranean, but they want that natural gas. And so Israel is rich. The Dead Sea has 1 billion tons of chemicals in it that are very, of course, the land of Israel is incredibly productive. So there's more and more reason that Russia has to desire Israel, and this coalition of nations has to desire Israel. Their pure hatred of them, number one, but also the wealth of Israel. And so I believe that the Gog and Magog war is unfolding before our eyes. The tension related to Jerusalem, East and West Jerusalem, and President Trump did recognize Jerusalem, the entirety of Jerusalem, as being the capital of Israel, which is incredible. But Joe Biden and the Biden administration, they are President Biden and the Biden administration, they are very much different in their philosophies and very much consistent with trying to pressure Israel to give up that land. So I just think we're seeing the end happening right before our eyes. And I never set dates, but I'm just saying the birth pangs are getting pretty hard, and I believe we're there.
Well, Jimmy, thank you so much for coming on. I mean, we're kind of coming to that time, so I'd like to toss it over to you guys for some closing thoughts, things you want people to walk away thinking about. I'll toss it over to Michael first, and then I'll give Jimmy an opportunity to speak into this as well. Okay. When you're thinking about Israel, when you're thinking about these kinds of time clocks, like what are that golden nugget that you want people thinking about, meditating on, keeping their eye on? Michael, I'm going to start with you. What are your closing thoughts on today's discussion?
Yeah, sure. Jimmy, thanks again so much for coming on the show. And I think I would just go back to something at the beginning because, eschatology is something that, Christians, they can get so upset at each other. They fight about it and they divide over it. And I know that our viewers come from lots of different perspectives. But one thing I appreciate about you, Jimmy, is you say that the purpose of prophecy is to encourage. And you try to maintain that tone, even though there are some ominous things that you talk about that really our hope is in the return of Jesus, and that's what purifies us. 1 John chapter 3, our hope is purified as we set our hope, or we are purified as we set up our hope upon Him who is pure, and will one day, upon His return, make us completely pure. So, regardless of where you land on this, set your hope upon Jesus, and one day, all this craziness and chaos is going to be over, and that is encouraging.
Excellent. Jimmy, same question.
Well, I think that for people, listening to this. But if you agree with everything I said, great. There may be 3 of you out there, but I appreciate you. But I regularly read and listen to people I don't agree with, just to challenge myself and just to make sure that I'm not getting lazy intellectually or lazy, scripturally. And so some of what I've said today may challenge some of the beliefs that you have. But I think that you'll never go wrong with loving Jesus, obviously, and loving
Amen.
Israel, and being kind in our hearts, and not angry or punitive toward Israel. So I think it's just a safe thing to say that we need to have a fear of God about us as it relates to the nation of Israel. And I just think if you do, based on Scripture, you're in a very safe place. If you don't, I think that there are many cautions beginning in Genesis 12 related to having a wrong attitude about Israel. But I hope something today in this has blessed you.
Yeah, no,
Yeah,
I'd be a guy who would categorize him as, I wouldn't be a pre-trib guy myself. I might even, I think, be accused of someone who would acclaim to something such as replacement theology. But when I hear you speaking of this, I think, man, I know for certain, hearing from you, that I'm encouraged to care for Israel and love Israel as a ethnic people group. I do believe that they have a special place in God's heart, and I do believe that God still has a plan for ethnic Israel, and there are specific prophecies in the Bibles directed specifically to them that do not incorporate the church in any way. So that being said, I think that people with different eschatological views, all of us can come to the table and go, there's something about Israel. We might disagree on what that something is, but I do think that there are special people. So, guys, thank you so much for tuning into this episode of Remnant Radio. Maybe you're out there and you're like, wow, that's an interesting eschatological position. I don't know how familiar I am with it or how comfortable I am with it. There are tons of eschatology positions that we've interviewed on this channel, Amil, pre-mill, historic pre-mill, pre-trib, post-trib, different positions on the millennium. What do we think about Daniel chapter 7, Islamic Antichrist? The list goes on and on and on. I will link up a playlist at the end of this video that you can check out if you would like to watch that. Tons of content. If you're interested in kind of breaking outside of your theological echo chamber, Jimmy mentioned wanting to be really well read from people he disagrees with. It's kind of what our channel's all about. So if you want to really know the ins and outs of different theologies from different churches and denominations, consider subscribing. And if you've been blessed by our content, this video or other videos we've done, consider giving in the links of the description below. Thank you so much, guys, for watching today, and we will see you next time. Blessings.